a free copy of the book if you would like that. Did anybody not receive a copy of the book and would like one? I can get that to you right this second. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You don't need one, Carly? Okay. Deb? I got a few extra. Here's one for Holly. Did I miss anybody? Copy of the book. I've got plenty of these. You can ask for it if you want it. Okay. Yeah, come see me after class if you need handouts from last week or if you would like a copy of the book. Did I miss anybody on the handouts for this morning right before we start here? Otherwise, they are here at the front. You can come get one right off the table. There you go. Did I miss a hand? Okay, this morning we are going to be, this is week 2, but we are on chapters 4 and 5 if you have the book and are following along with us. We're going to be talking about science and what I have in quotes here, this idea of the new atheism. So, a couple of quick things about the book. If you got the book from me sort of in the first round, before today, you received a copy that looks like this. It just has a little curl of wood shaving on the front. This is the 2009 printing. This is what I'm reading and what I'm teaching out of. I'm going to call this the no chisel version. And it comes with, there's a red bookmark that's in that you should have. If you didn't get a red bookmark, I've got those up here. That's got our schedule and what you'll be reading along with us each week. When I ordered books on Tuesday, for those of you, because I ran out, I received this, what I'm going to call the chisel version. It's got a chisel for the wood shaving. This is a 2024 updated printing. They removed a chapter, and one of the ones that we're talking about today, actually. So what's chapter 5 in that old version of the book about the new atheism? It's not in this copy. So you're going to have chapter 4 that says, what about science? And then it goes to chapter 5, are the New Testament records reliable, which is next week. So it's missing a little bit of material. So I did a different bookmark. You have a blue bookmark. It has a different chapter list. But other than that, the books should be pretty much the same. They just did an update because it had been, what's the math on that, 15 years since the last printing. So the chisel version, missing a chapter if you have that. But again, what we're going to talk about today will pretty much cover what you need to know about the new atheism. So just so we're all on the same page, or because we're going to end up on different pages when I start talking about chapter numbers after this week. So just follow along with what's on your bookmark. And again, handouts, I've got extra printings of last week's handout up here. I've got this week's handout also up here on this round table in the front, if you did not get a copy of that. These are also available on the website along with the PowerPoint slides and the video recordings. If you scan that QR code on the seat in front of you, where we ask the visitors to go to the connection card, if you scroll down, there's a resources button. You tap on that and then find More Than a Carpenter. You'll find PowerPoint slides, handouts, and videos for each of the weeks. Or you can just go through, if you're at home on your computer, go to cvchurchofchrist.org. There's a resources button. It's all in the same place there. So, yes. Yes, the handout. Okay. So, by way of a bit of a recap, because we've got a few new faces in here that were here last Sunday, this class, More Than a Carpenter, is literally, it's talking about Jesus, who was more than just a man, more than just the carpenter from Nazareth. And what do we have to back that up when we say he was more than that? When we say indeed he was not only the promised Messiah that had been prophesied about in the Old Testament, he is indeed the Son of God himself. He's more than just a man. We started by talking about last week, what makes Jesus different from any other man who's ever walked the face of the planet? We started by talking about this concept of faith, because what's ultimately coming up here in this conversation is we have faith. We have faith in Jesus, but what is our faith based on? From what set of evidence have we decided to have faith in Jesus? And I mention that because what we are often accused of by people who do not have faith in Jesus is we have a blind faith. We have a faith in some guy being the Son of God just because he said he was, and that's really all there is to it, is what we're often accused of. And the whole point of this class is to tell you so that you have this information sort of systematically available to you to answer somebody who says that to you. Say, well, that's actually not true at all. It's the opposite. We have what Hebrews 11:1 says, we have assurance of things that we hope for. We have more than just a hope or a glimmer of I wish. We have assurance, real assurance, and we have conviction, right? Conviction is a hard word to drop about something. You've got to be absolutely sure about that before you're convicted of it. It's not just, oh, I thought this the other day in my mind and I think it might be true, right? Convicted about things we do not see. And this evidence that we're talking about in this class backs up the conviction we have in things that we cannot see. So there's a lot more to it than just a blind faith. We talked about this sentence from the book about, for many people today, Jesus' claim to be the Son of God is just too exclusive. Right? That's the reason why a lot of people say they don't believe it. Well, the issue is not what we want to believe or what we want to be true, but rather, what did Jesus actually claim about himself? We have to answer that question, not what do we wish Jesus had claimed. So what did he really claim, and is that claim true? That's the question. And so we talked about last week, we took this three-part argument, we called it Lewis's trilemma. He's the one who made it most famous, C.S. Lewis, in the book Mere Christianity, and said based on the claims that Jesus made, he's either lying about it, or he's crazy, or it's all true. And if it's all true, he really is Lord. And so we went through systematically, how would we determine if Jesus is a liar? How would we determine if he's crazy? And if we can rule those two things out, well, all that's left is he's Lord. And I said, yes, that's great, but I think there's one more possibility, because it's possible that Jesus could be a legend. All those claims that we have written in the Bible may not actually be what Jesus claimed. How do we know that that's actually what Jesus claimed to be? How do we know that the book itself, the text, has not been messed around with? How do we know that this is accurate? So next Sunday and the Sunday after, we're going to spend some time going through how do we know we can trust the Bible as a reliable, historically accurate source, and how can we trust the eyewitnesses whose accounts we read in the Bible? Those are kind of two separate questions. So the text and then the people themselves who are making testimony about Jesus that we are using as evidence. So that's to come. Today we're going to do one last little foundational thing. As we move out of talking about faith, I want us to talk a little bit about science and this group of people that are called the New Atheists. Because what often is argued against people who believe is that, well, haven't we learned enough through science that we don't really need God anymore? We can explain basically everything through scientific processes. So not only is there no God, there's actually even no reasonable or logical need for him in the first place. So we're going to talk about the problems with that statement. If you're ever confronted with that, how do you answer someone who says, because I understand science, I don't need God? And then this particular group, New Atheism, this is a group you're likely to encounter people who claim a viewpoint of atheism, who will espouse a lot of the things that these people are teaching. So this will be the angle from which a lot of your atheist friends could be coming from. And it takes a very particular understanding of what their what their thought process is as they arrived at atheism and how to counteract those arguments. So let me ask you the question as we start out. I promised more discussion this week than there was last week, and I'm going to try to keep discussion going moving forward. What do you think about this question? Because we often hear our faith and science are in conflict. Let me ask you this morning, from your viewpoint, should they be in conflict? Is there any particular reason why? Now, I'm not talking about scientists. I'm not talking about the people who do science and might do science poorly, but science itself as a set of ways of looking at the world and uncovering and discovering things versus faith, which we spent a lot of time last week. I'm not going to embellish that. So should they be in conflict? Should it be one or the other? What do you think?
I don't think they should be in conflict, but I do think that sometimes science you have to kind of really be cautious about, because people are the ones that are involved with that, and sometimes there's corruption.
Yeah.
People get paid off to get results a
Sure.
certain way, and so I think sometimes you just have to be very careful.
Yeah?
Faith is pretty much straightforward.
It seems straightforward enough to us, right? But science can be. So you're saying it can be misused. It can be used as a weapon in a basically a way that it shouldn't have been used,
Yes.
kind of outside its bounds. Did I see another hand over here? Jason.
I think they should be complementary.
Should be complementary. Okay.
Because with the and like with the because God since God created everything, science is just a way of explaining what He did in our terms.
Yeah.
Basically. And but where the go off what she was saying.
Yeah.
A scientific process starts with a hypothesis, right?
Mm-hmm.
So whatever you're trying to prove or disprove is where that's going to go.
Yeah.
So if you're trying to disprove religion, God, whatever, you're going to put in your results towards that. Your results are going to follow that.
Right.
They could follow that, but
Yeah. So there's a couple really profound things
that's where
there.
it starts to break off. Where you start your thoughts.
There's a couple profound things in these answers. Jason started off with, well, if God created everything, shouldn't science just be what's used for us to understand and uncover those things that He did create? So there's a worldview issue there, right? A lot of this, the answer to this depends on what your worldview is, what your starting point is, because if you're the other side of the coin, as Jason was talking about, you have an aim or a goal or an angle or a bias that you're working towards. You're going to use science to shape based on your worldview. So based on your worldview, faith and science, you may think should be in conflict, or maybe not. Also, where Tina, sorry, I was blanking on your name. Where Tina was saying, right, some people will misuse science to get the answer that they want based on some sort of corruption. Yeah.
There will be some conflict because faith is the evidence of things unseen.
Yeah.
Science is the evidence of things seen. Right? But God created all to allow us to get to where He be.
Did you catch that, what John said? They cover different territories, don't they, when it really comes down to it? So it's not that they're in conflict over this one set of turf, but science is used to uncover things we can see. Faith is about the things that we can't see. Should they actually be working more in harmony, in a more complementary way, like Jason was talking about? That's the argument that I'm going to make today. If we do both of these things right, they should work in a complementary way. So your worldview may be one of two things. Number one, your worldview might be this: if you cannot prove something scientifically, it can't be real or it can't be true. You're going to run into a lot of people who think this way when they don't believe in God. They don't believe in God because they can't do anything to prove Him scientifically. And since He can't be proven scientifically, they don't believe in Him. Well, there's some problems with that we'll get to in a second. Or you may have this view. Some things that are real or true lie outside of the bounds of scientific proof. Now, spoiler alert, that's where I land. And I think that's where a lot of us, we understand that science has its limitations. We're going to talk about some of those limitations today, that it does not have a monopoly on only being able to use science to describe things that are real or true. And that's basically, you can think about what these things are just by looking at what the scientific method is, right? You start, as Jason said, by forming a hypothesis about something. If you have a question, you start by saying, well, maybe this is the explanation. Then you're going to design an experiment to test that hypothesis, right? Then you're going to run that experiment, and along the way, you're making observations, physical observations about whatever it is that you're testing. Then you're going to make conclusions. And then, based on what you see, you're going to take that hypothesis to fit the data. And you're going to repeat and make sure that that tweaked hypothesis works. And you're going to repeat and repeat until you've got something where the experiment and the observations match this hypothesis, as you've gotten your hypothesis to match, the observations, and it's repeatable over and over. So there's some assumptions within this method. Number one, you have to have a subject that can be tested in a repeatable manner. If you can't do that, you cannot use this process of science to determine anything about it. And that subject and the tests that you're doing need to be able to be physically observed. You can do that either directly by actually physically seeing something or it can be indirectly observed, like if you can just measure its effects. Like, I can't see gravity as an entity, but I can see the effects that it has on things. So either way, gravity lies in something that we can test. It's something we can test scientifically because we can observe it indirectly. So here's your thought question. Because we're talking about Jesus of Nazareth. We talked about last week, he's an established historical figure, and nobody who's serious, even in secular academia, denies that he existed as a historical person. Can we use this scientific method to determine whether or not a historical event happened? Or let's just go ahead and be specific. To determine anything about the life of Jesus. Can we use science for that? I heard a couple verbal no's, and I saw even a few more head shakes. No. Why not? Why can't... It's not repeatable? Rich?
Yeah, all of this is testimonial, which is not going to leave like
Right.
archaeological record.
Right.
Which is a testimonial.
Right. If we want to talk about repeatable or observable, where is Jesus' body? We can't actually go get his body. It rose from the grave and ascended to heaven. It's not here. We can't go get it and test it with anything. But let's look at another historical person. Let's use, for example, George Washington. We're going to determine if something that's said about George Washington was true or not. What do we have to base that on? We can't go wake him up out of the grave and ask him directly. We have to use written or oral testimony that was there, cross-reference it with some other sources if we can find them and see when things agree, and then we would make a determination of, well, okay, this might be true. Maybe it's not. Because the problem is, this is from the angle of someone who has studied science. You can't use science to prove everything. There's a different method for talking about historical events, and it's not the scientific method. It's called the historical method. So this is where we're going to talk about things that lie outside the bounds of science, can still be studied. You use a slightly different method. You start by collecting data from sources. You got primary sources. Maybe if you're looking for something about George Washington, something that he hand wrote in a diary that was preserved, or secondary sources, a historian who was researching and wrote about him based on evidence. Then you evaluate the data and these sources. You're checking these sources for their accuracy, for their reliability, for any biases that they have. And then you're interpreting that data in context of when it was written, understanding who wrote it, what might have led them to write it. All of these things come into this, but nowhere in here is an experiment or anything physically tangible that you're observing. Then you write the history, you get that story together, and then you refine every time there's new data that comes around. So, for example, the history books that we have, there's been new discoveries since, if you're, let's say you're 20 or 30 or more years older than me, the history that you studied in school, there may have been new discoveries since then, so the things that I learned may have been different from the things that you learned because we continue to add to our knowledge base. It's constantly changing in that way. So you can see it's a very different method. We're not approaching this anywhere near a scientific method to talk about history. This is very similar also to what's being used in the courtroom in a legal setting. It can also be called the historical legal method. So you think about the goal of a legal case. You're not trying to arrive at any kind of scientific observable proof for most court cases, right? What's your goal? Does anybody know the phrase what your goal is if you're in a trial and the prosecution is trying to prove its case to a certain level, what that level is called in legal terminology? Beyond a reasonable doubt. That's what we're looking for in using the historical method to determine if something is true. Beyond a reasonable doubt. So basically, is there any way a reasonable person would look at this evidence that's been collected about this case, about this person, about this event, and say it's not true? Well, that feels a little bit fluffy, I guess. It doesn't feel like it's a hard standard, right? Because scientific proof sounds like a hard standard. You either see it or you don't. And this beyond a reasonable doubt means there could be a little gray area here. Yes, there is. There is a little bit of a gray area here. It's not the same process, but it's the best that we can do when you can't do a repeatable test on a physically observable object, right? And we're going to use, as Rich was talking about, testimonies, right? Oral testimony, written testimony, and we can use supporting exhibits, pieces of evidence. This would be like where DNA might come in to play in a court case to prove that somebody was at a certain place and they left behind that evidence, right? So just look at how we're approaching this question differently than just scientifically. It's not in the same arena as science. So science cannot answer every question that we have. Let's talk for a little bit about atheism as we're going to transition into confronting atheism or being confronted by atheism. How do we respond? Atheism is not a new thing. Atheism didn't just start happening a couple hundred years ago in the Enlightenment. It's been around forever. Atheists are referred to in the Bible. Psalm 14 describes this. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. People have been denying the existence, or at least if they don't deny the existence, they completely ignore his lordship of God since biblical times. I think also about Romans chapter 1. If you read Romans 1, 18 through 23, this is a very clear description of people who are functionally atheistic in their living, if not in their belief as well. Right? When Paul talks about the wrath of God being revealed against people who suppress the truth, because what can be known about God is plain to them because God has revealed it or has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, right, his eternal power, his divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. It's talking about people who, although they knew God, don't honor him with their lives, but basically it says, claiming to be wise, they became fools. They exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling the creation. Deciding to turn around and worship the creation rather than the Creator is exactly what's being described here, and this is exactly what atheism boils down to. An atheist, I don't know if there's any in here, might actually raise a hand and say, well, that's not right because I don't have a God. I deny the existence of a God. And what Romans is describing here as an atheist is someone who has turned around and rejected the true God and made themselves or something else in creation their God. Everyone has a God. Whether or not you acknowledge that it's the real one doesn't mean you don't have a God. But David.
These were interesting verses that you referenced because it's something that, with this class that I'm thinking about, that what's always fascinating to me is that we always kind of have this dichotomy of faith and science.
Mm-hmm.
But yet when you're looking at Scripture, I don't necessarily know that God intends the dynamic to be one where we're sort of operating in as much doubt as we think we have.
Yeah.
Like for instance, because the Scriptures tell us that God has made it abundantly clear that he exists. Something has changed over time. It's less clear to us, but then thinking about, okay, if God has revealed himself using creation and things that we can, observe and all this kind of stuff, then this idea that, well, I'm just operating on quote unquote faith in the absence of belief. No, that's not true. I, as a Christian, am taking into consideration all of the stuff that God has done. And so it's an interesting thing of saying that realistically, as you become as you become a follower of Jesus Christ and then you are continuing that process of sanctification, the evidence becomes more and more overwhelming to where you get to a point you're going, the idea that there's nothing here, there's so much evidence all around me that I wake up to every morning and observe and see that it's just so plain.
Yeah.
That it's no longer really a question of faith.
Yeah.
It's just the certainty of God's existence. And so it's just an interesting thing I'm wrestling with as going through this.
Yeah. Well, we're going to talk about Johann Kepler in just a few minutes. Very similar outlook on life. One of the pioneers of astronomy, right? And what his view of this was. So that's coming. Actually, right now, here he is in the middle. What about these historical roots of science? Where did science even begin? It began in a very similar place to what David was just talking about and what Jason was talking about earlier. Early scientists sought to understand and study the natural world specifically because of their belief in God, not in spite of. Not in a way to disprove God, but in a way to look at, realizing as they look around them, I live in an amazing world. And this didn't just happen. I want to know more. Like, they have the Bible and they understand this. They've read Romans 1. They know what Paul was saying about how clear and how plain it is because they could see it themselves. And these early thinkers, people like Francis Bacon, people like Johann Kepler, people like Isaac Newton had a sincere, firm, unshakable belief in God and studied science the way that they did because they wanted to honor him and understand him more and reveal him to more people. This is a couple of quotes by Kepler that I put on the slide and the more I read this, I was like, you know what, this speaks to me because this is exactly why I went into science before I went into ministries. I had this exact goal of doing what I was going to do, studying geology, as Kepler did with astronomy. He said, the chief aim of all investigations of the external world should be to discover the rational order and harmony which has been imposed on it by God and which he revealed to us in the language of mathematics. They could see that order. That order was unmistakable and unmissable. He said, those laws of nature that we're trying to describe, those are within the grasp of the human mind. He believed that God wanted us to recognize them by creating us after his own image so that we could share in his own thoughts. This was for Kepler a pursuit to grow closer to God, to understand him better. Emily.
The belief that there is a rational order and harmony in the world is birthed out of this Christian worldview.
That's exactly right.
Without that, you are not able to establish a scientific method because modern science would assume that the world is chaotic, full of entropy, and getting more chaotic.
Right.
It doesn't have that harmony. So without
Right.
that original basis of rational order and harmony, you can't have this scientific field that we now see today. It's birthed out of that.
That's exactly right. The fact that we can even study science at all is a testimony to God himself, having designed the world to be studied. Because the processes of evolution don't ultimately arrive at a world that can be reliably studied. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes. So as opposed to science, generally, where you would find skepticism or atheism among popular thinkers, that came out of philosophy. That didn't even come out of science. Science has espoused it, but it didn't start there. So the early scientists were indeed believers, and it's the philosophers who were beginning to teach these things that led to what we call atheism. People like Voltaire, people like Nietzsche. God is dead, right? That was Nietzsche's favorite or famous quote. Albert Camus, he was a teacher of a certain school of thought called absurdism. It actually went to the point of saying the quiet part out loud about if God is dead, none of this makes sense and none of this is worth living for. That was Albert Camus, who was one of the leaders in that school of thought in the early 1900s. Like, you see how it transitions to finally reaching that point where this is all meaningless if there's no God. And he said, well, here's what you do with that as a non-believer, and to mixed reviews. Here's a quote by Voltaire to talk about where his atheism was coming from. And I want you to catch a little wrinkle in here that's going to be different from what we talk about with the new atheists in a minute. He said, the Christian religion is assuredly the most ridiculous, the most absurd, and the most bloody religion which has ever infected this world. Your Majesty, this is in a letter to, I believe it was the King of Prussia at the time. Your Majesty will do the human race an eternal service by extirpating this infamous superstition. I do not say among the rabble, who are not worthy of being enlightened and who are apt for every yoke, but I say among honest people, among men who think, among those who wish to think. Some flowery language, but do you catch what he's saying there? He's saying Christianity should be done away with among those of us who can think and who can actually move the world forward. It's useful for all of those common people. Let's keep it in place. There's something about it that keeps them in line with the values that it teaches. There's something, he's basically saying there's something positive for the world if we keep it around in certain courts, but we don't have to think that way. That flips. We're going to talk about the new atheism. So if you have 2024 printing, I'm sorry, you don't have this chapter. This is chapter 5 in this older version of the book that doesn't have the big chisel in front. You got the chisel copy. Just try to follow along as best you can. Starting in somewhere around the early 2000s, even though this had been building for some time, the early 2000s, a new group of atheists started to become more prominent. They were using books and TV and debates, public debates, as their main way of getting their message out. And they didn't really have any arguments about the existence of God, but they did have a radically different approach to atheism, different from what we just read from Voltaire from the 1700s and those who followed after him. Because the new atheists had a singular goal of eradicating the rational grounds for belief. Basically convince people that you are insane if you still believe in God in the year, 2005 is I think when Richard Dawkins' book came out. There's no rational grounds for you to even hold on to faith at this point because it can't be true because science has proved all of these things. And ultimately trying to get people to walk away from their faith. And a lot of people did. I remember walking around high school. When did I graduate? 07? How many years ago was that? Don't answer that out loud. I graduated high school 18 years ago. I remember seeing people walking around, they got their textbooks, and right and there's a copy of Dawkins. What was that book he wrote? The God Delusion. Or you have Christopher Hitchens' God is Not Great was his book. That was popular at the time, right? So like in high school, some kids were eating this. We even had, I believe it was my junior year, we had a free thinkers club that started up, and some of the kids that Emily and I were in band with were in this group. And so this started to take hold in the younger generations very quickly because they were using the right approach to get people's attention in that generation. And so if you encounter people who are atheists today, they've got probably some influence from this group. It's people like Sam Harris. You can find him on YouTube all over the place. Christopher Hitchens, he did pass away, 10 years ago or so. Richard Dawkins, he's still around. And so these guys and people who kind of are affiliated with them are teaching this new brand of atheism that is completely, it's vitriolic, it's completely opposed to anybody continuing to hold religious belief because in their view, it's completely worthless. It doesn't serve any positive purpose to the world. We're running short on time, so I'm skipping ahead to this quote by Richard Dawkins. But if you have the PowerPoint slides, you can go back and read some things that Harris and Hitchens were writing. Dawkins says this in a couple different places, 2 different quotes. This is not from the same source. Religion is about turning untested belief into unshakable truth through the power of institutions and the passage of time. That idea of an untested belief, basically he's making the accusation. We've got nothing to back our statements up. He says, faith is the great cop-out, the great excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate evidence. Faith is the belief in spite of, even perhaps because of, the lack of evidence. This is the viewpoint. This is the viewpoint that you're going to run into. So I ask the question, is it more reasonable to be an atheist than to have faith? Just looking at this idea of reason, and I do see some hands. I apologize. I got to keep moving because I want to get through this to have time for a short video. If we have time at the end, I'd love to take some comments if we can do that. Emily kind of already walked us through this. Let me ask you the question, if atheism is more reasonable, why does the natural world make any sense at all? Because it's a basic assumption of science that we have an orderly and a knowable world combined with we have trustworthy minds that are capable of grasping it. And I want you to think about this. If our brains, not to mention everything else, all of this is random evolution product that had no push from a creator, no design by a creator to become what it is, then why should we trust any of it? Why should we think we can think reasonably about it if it was all random? And here's the catch. You can't use science to answer this, because this is a basic assumption of science itself. Science can't answer its own assumptions using its own processes. You have to go outside of science to even determine if you can trust your own mind. I find that so ironic that this has been missed, or this has been ignored or avoided all of these years. Let me ask you this, is atheism itself even more scientific? Does the scientific evidence for the things that we've uncovered, does that lead us to determine that we must not have a God, or that we probably do have a God? Think about DNA. Think about the fact that within each one of your cells there is an orderly, self-replicating code that has determined physically who you are. And it's different from everybody else's in this room and indeed in this world, unless you have an identical twin. And it's hard to look at that, to see that it's a code that can be read, it's a code that can be understood and decoded, and it just happened. And it's complex enough to determine every single thing about you, who you are as a physical person. If I see a code, a computer running a code that's spitting out outputs that make reasonable sense, what's my number one conclusion? Somebody wrote that program. Has anybody in here ever taken a computer class where you had to write code and run it through a machine with punch cards if you're of a certain age, or you just ran it through a compiler if you're a little closer to my age, right? What happened, Rich? Did you do punch cards and like running Fortran on punch cards or C or something like that? What happened if you messed even one of those punch cards up or it got out of order in the process?
It doesn't do anything, it crashes.
It doesn't do anything. It's not that it's a little bit off. The whole thing just... Codes mean something because they are complete and they are correct 100%. It's hard to get a code just a little bit off randomly and it still do what it's needing to do. You have that within you. And the programmer wrote the code. That's the only logical explanation based on everything we know about codes, observing them in every other instance in science other than the DNA within us, because somehow the DNA is the one code that didn't have to be written by someone else. What about the fine-tuning of the universe? I love talking about this, but I did a class on this about 1.5 years ago. Let me give you just this. And Dawkins himself has said that to him, he doesn't believe, but if he was to believe, this is the one line of evidence that he might be convinced to believe on, even though he hasn't been. So far, scientists have uncovered 122 separate physical constants that describe the way the universe works. And these physical constants, these are not like parts of an equation. These are independent, observable properties of the universe itself. They don't depend on any other variable. They just are. One of those is the expansion rate of the universe. Edwin Hubble has already proved this out. Without a doubt, we know that the universe is expanding. It's getting bigger. Things are getting farther apart. You can see it with telescopes. And if this is actually from Stephen Hawking. Stephen Hawking made this statement. If the initial expansion rate of the universe, so from his view, after a Big Bang, or from our view, after God set it in motion, created it at the first moment, was off by a factor of 1 in 10 to the third. It's 1 in 100 quadrillion. It was off by that much on the slow end. It wouldn't be expanding fast enough to counteract gravity, and the whole thing would collapse on itself. If it was going that much, that little bit too fast, then gravity wouldn't be able to hold everything together. We wouldn't have stars and planets and galaxies. Balanced on the that's slimmer than a razor's edge. If the rotation period of the Earth was just a little bit longer, then the temperature extremes would be too great for us to withstand. At night, you'd have an ice planet. On the sunny side, you would have just burn everything up. Or if it's too short, then the atmospheric wind velocities, right, because we have an air atmosphere where we can produce wind, those velocities would be too great for us to withstand. So balanced, right on that razor's edge, right where it should be. In the words of some scientists, it almost looks like somebody's been monkeying around with physics to make it all work. Imagine that. Hugh Ross, he is a physicist and a believer, went through and calculated, knowing all of these physical constants that we have, what's the probability that they all work together to make a world that's habitable by humanity? The chance of that happening randomly is 1 chance in 10 to the power of 138. I cannot even begin to describe to you how big that number is. Basically, if you want to look at this as a probability exercise, the chance of any one planet in all of the universe developing all of the known characteristics to be life-sustaining is like this. It's like taking every atom in the universe, putting them in a big pile, shuffling them all around, and you have to pick one correct atom out of all of that. and you reach into the pile and you grab it correctly. And you do that 68 times in a row, having randomly shuffled it all around. That's the probability that any single planet can sustain life in the universe, if it's random. Let me throw that in there. If it's random. The chance is a lot higher if there's a creator who's designing it to be habited by life. So, is atheism more moral? Let me just give you these two quotes. And these are the page numbers. Again, I'm sorry. This is now, and page numbers are off. This is in the Red Bookmark book. If there is no God, then where do moral obligations come from in the first place? Why is there a right and a wrong that we can rely on as a standard? How would you define evil without a transcendent moral standard of good? I want you to think about that for a minute. There is this logical argument for morality that says this: if objective moral values exist, which we believe they do, there is a right and a wrong. Every little kid who has reached a certain age can even tell you this. Murder is wrong universally. Torture is wrong universally. Somehow that is. Well, if objective moral values exist, there must have been a God who exists to have set them in place. We do recognize that objective moral values exist. So therefore, God must exist. The alternative that an atheist, and I've heard this actually, again, they said the quiet part out loud in a debate once, is said, no, it wasn't God, humanity and society have determined what is right and wrong. Oh gosh, that's a scary statement to make. If right and wrong exists because we have defined it, what happens when we change our minds and murder and torture is now acceptable? Think about what that world looks like. We don't operate in a world like that, and no one would pretend to say that those would ever be okay. Last thing I'd like to do, Robbie, if you can make sure we got sound here. I started talking about the new atheists with Dawkins. He's called Darwin's Bulldog is his nickname. This floored me. He got on an interview on British television and said these words.
We've got passion, we've got determination.
Sorry,
Like, and
I
if
don't
we
pay
set
for
our
YouTube
sights on
Premium.
something, you better believe it's happening.
Can you skip to that video there in the bottom corner, Robbie, on that computer?
We always felt like our
Should be a skip ad. And
content was all about entertainment and being fun, but there was also this,
Wix gives you the
I'm
power
seeing they
of
can skip the
AI
video
to
and
build the
3, 2,
website you
1,
need
see that?
with full business functionality and a design tailored just for you.
I'll have to play some a little
Customize
bit, but
every element of your web.
here's the point. We're not going to watch them do yoga on the ads. Here's the point. He's interviewed on British television and says that he is horrified that in the UK, Ramadan is being celebrated above Easter. Because he considers himself, even though I'm not a believer, I consider myself a cultural Christian. These are his words. I encourage you to actually go Google this and go find this video later. I consider myself a cultural Christian, and I think it would be horrible if we lost the things that made us a Christian nation, our beautiful parish churches and all of these things. And it's just ironic that someone who has been so staunchly against Christianity and trying to squash it for almost a generation would now lament the loss of the things that Christianity had done to his country to make it what it was. That's a powerful testimony, whether he wants to admit it or not, into the virtues of our faith and what it means to follow Christ, what it means that we have over 2,000 years put into practice the things that he taught. We talked last week about the fruit of Jesus' ministry being one of the most powerful evidences for his lordship. We live in a country where the fruit of his ministry that has gone on in the work of the church still exists, and so does Dawkins, and he laments the loss of it despite his unbelief. I want you to think about that, the irony of this. The irony of this that speaks to, does his viewpoint hold, certainly doesn't hold eternal merit because everything's going to burn up and fire. Does it hold any long-term merit for society? I leave you with this, the greatest commandment. As we talk about science today, teacher, which is the great commandment in the law? And Jesus says to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. All three of those. Don't be afraid to love God with your mind. Don't be afraid to explore the world that he's created. The deeper you get into it, I'm convinced the more we are all going to see and be just stunned by his glory and his creative power. Hope this has been something that's been helpful for you today. We're going to dig into the New Testament records next Sunday. Is the Bible a reliable source for us to pull evidence about the historical man Jesus to tell us more about who he is, who he claimed to be? See you next week. Thank you.